You guys can hear me pretty much without the mic too, right? Just so I know I'm speaking loud enough. But anyway, I won't be talking too much about libertarianism and the Libertarian Party, except in so much as I find my experiences useful to illustrate a point. But anyway, I like the question the way Shabir posed it, which is, are we stuck in the two-party system? I like the question because you can actually break it down and ask questions about the components themselves. For example, first of all, are we stuck in the two-party system? Well, who's we? We're talking about Americans generally, or we're talking about Muslims more specifically? We're talking about American Muslims more specifically. I don't think the difference between Americans and American Muslims is significantly different, but if we're talking about American Muslims, then I think there's a distinction that we can make that'll help us question our intentions and the reasons we vote the way we do. So if we're talking about American Muslims in the context of this election cycle, we're talking about voting as part of our identity. I identify as Muslim and this is why I'm going to vote the way I'm voting. Or are we voting, or is our civic engagement based on theological principles or religious jurisprudence? And the difference I would posit is, if you're voting because your identity, and I'm not, criticizing either camp, it's perfectly valid either way, and to the extent that it's not valid, it's beyond the scope of this conversation. I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I won't venture into those waters. But if you're voting based on your identity, I'd say you're going to be more prone to, voting against bigotry. That's going to have a greater resonance within you. Not mentioning any names. If you're voting because you feel like you have some kind of moral, responsibility, you might focus on our foreign policy. What candidate or what party has the best stance on foreign policy issues? So we can unpack all that out of the word "we." All right. What about stuck? What does stuck mean? We'll come back to that. And then the two-party system. Well, the question assumes that the two-party system is bad, doesn't it? Are we stuck in the two-party system? What if I like the two-party system? And it has a very negative tone, doesn't it? But maybe two-party system is just a reflection of human nature. You look at other countries, non-specific example, Egypt, you have a very binary, in their first democratic election, they had a very binary choice too, and it was, I think, 49, 51%, something like that, of the vote went one way or the other. Black and white, Coke, Pepsi, things tend to be very binary in nature. Maybe it's just human nature. And we'll come back to problems in the two-party system in the next segment. But then, again, what does stuck mean? We're stuck in the two-party system. Do we not do anything about it? We're stuck, we go with it. It is what it is. I'd argue we're not. So the short answer, I would say, is no. We'll travel the road and we'll exercise a little intellectual rigor and we'll get there. So how deeply rooted is our country in the two-party system? So we'll give a quick history lesson. I've identified in my preparation for this 4 times in our history where the two-party system was either non-existent or challenged in some way. So the first time that the two-party system was challenged is probably, maybe some of you are thinking of it, but at the very founding, right? I mean, show of hands, who's familiar with the George Washington's farewell address? And what did he warn against in the farewell address, among other things? Against the party system, political parties. He was very critical of that. Fast forward to about 1817, and you have President James Monroe, who actually, in his own way, abolished the two-party system that existed up until the time. Up until then, you had the Whig Party and the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. But with James Monroe elected, he took active steps to repeal the party system that was in place at the time, such that he completely destroyed the Federalist Party. It was gone after after his presidency. So I would say, and he did things like, he did that by appointing people to different offices that were skeptical of the party, that were skeptical of, the party system, and just in a kind of bipartisan approach to things, he was able to kind of unite the country in that way. And then dealing with I believe he was from the Whig Party, or I'm sorry, the Democratic Republican Party. But when he was talking to the Whig Party, members of the Whig Party, he would, he'd be very diplomatic with them. He would, accommodate them. But then in practice, he would kind of just ignore them. The third time, I'm having trouble remembering the third time off the top of my head. But the most recent example is definitely Ross Perot. I think almost all of us were alive during the time. Yeah, 1996. Yeah, we were pretty much all alive back then. But anyway, Ross Perot, he ran, and he presented a serious, or up until election day, presented a serious challenge to the two-party system by running a strong campaign, and at times he was beating the two major parties in the polls. And then, of course, on election day, I think he walked away with 8% of the vote. After which, the Reform Party, which he was a part of, got major party status. But what happened in, I think, less than 4 years, the Reform Party completely died. Not simply for the fact it's debated, but the Reform Party had gotten federal funds, which if you receive more than 5% of the popular vote in the general election, as if you're Green Party fans, you might know about this, but if you receive more than 5% of the vote in the general election, you get major party status, which gives you automatic ballot access and matching federal funds. So what happened to the Reform Party when they got these matching federal funds? It pretty much, it drew everybody out of the woodwork to get this easy ballot access, easy campaign money, and then that pretty much destroyed the party because you have all these outsiders coming in and you destroy the party. Which kind of brings me to the next point is, if you can so easily destroy a party, is it even, is it a good idea to have political parties that aren't rooted in some kind of deep philosophy? Which I think is, highly illustrative of the problems. Why have a party if you're not united on one principle? Being libertarian, I'm obviously very skeptical of socialism, but at least any decent socialist party has a pretty solid platform, has pretty solid principles, and they're united in that sense, and you can expect a certain amount of consistency. Whereas the Democratic, party is not to say they're not based on anything. They're based on the idea of, a strong federal government. If you go back 200 years, I think you'll find that's the genesis of their philosophy. But even then, is that really a holistic approach to things? I don't think so. I mean, you can't answer every problem with more government, no matter what party or philosophy you adhere to. So interestingly, just again, in preparing for this talk, and this will demonstrate the point I was just making, when I was preparing for this talk, I went back to 1848 and 1900 and looked at the Democratic Party, which is the Democratic Republican Party is what you now call the Democrat Party. And I looked at their platform back then. And what you find is actually there's a lot of things in the platform back then that they've actually eroded now. Things that we really like as millennials, as college students, things that we would find really enticing, that existed in the platform back then that perhaps we don't now. And just the examples that struck me were I think it was non-interventionism, and skepticism of the national bank. And I encourage you to take a look at that if you tend to vote Democratic, or if you're closer to that camp. I would say take a look at, just Google 1848, 1900, and whatever year you have, and just take a look at the platform and how it's evolved over time, and see if that doesn't sway your understanding of the party system the way it exists today. And then also, there are things that maybe aren't problem with the two-party system per se, but, and that's another thing. Going back to the question, we can unpack the two-party system. What does the two-party system mean? Do we mean America's two-party system? If we are, then we're talking about the specific election laws that we have in place here that protect the two major parties. And without being partisan, it's pretty uncontroversial to say that our law protects the two major parties. For example, you have the Electoral College, and I'm sure who's here's a big fan of the Electoral College? Raise your hand high. All right, now the non-sarcastic members. All right, exactly. So I don't have to get too much into detail about that. Gerrymandering, huge. You know, if me and Shiroz are running for office, it's pretty easy for me to exclude the rest of you if we're the ones holding power. So, I'm sorry, excuse me one second. So I actually bought my sample ballot for this November to demonstrate a very practical issue as it relates to third parties. So I don't know if you can all see this, but if you look at the first two columns, you have the Republican Party and you have the Democrat Party. And that'll be like that every year in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, we typically have overall, we kind of have pretty decent election law, as opposed to other states that are more prohibitive. But just take that for example. How unfair is that the Democrats and the Republicans will randomly choose between the first two columns, and then other philosophies, other movements, other ideas have to struggle to get the same level of recognition. So the way it works for the others is there's another separate lottery for the rest of the columns. So for example, in Monmouth County, if you live in Monmouth County, Jill is going to be in column 4, and then the Libertarian Party is going to be in column 5. And I mean, does that really make sense? So if we're talking about fighting the two-party system, we have to talk about fighting laws, And I don't think we have to elect non-Republicans and non-Democrats necessarily to change that. But I mean, are these individuals who are elected by their party to office, are they really going to put, election law or the country's interests above their party? I'd be very hard for us to believe that and to have confidence that they would do that, although it is in theory possible. And then looking forward, what are our alternatives, right? We have the multi-party system, which works well in other countries. They have, and we can talk about what a multi-party system is in a second, but it works well in other countries. Can we have no party system? Just people run for office and just ban the existence of political parties? Does anybody know why that might be a problem? Legitimate question to the audience.
We have the right to peacefully assemble.
Exactly, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, assemble, and the whole penumbra of rights that are found in the Bill of Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, sorry. So I think maybe in a different world, we could say you have the freedom of speech and the freedom to assemble. But running for office, we might make an exception and say, no, we're not going to allow political parties because that affects the public. In private, you can assemble however you want. In the context of America, I don't think that's going to ever fly. Nor do I think it should. I'm just presenting a problem for you to think about. We can change at least the way we vote, right? We can keep everything the way it is, get rid of the Electoral College, and then change the first past the post voting system, the winner takes all voting system, and just have, when you go to the ballot box, you have, vote for your top 2 or your top 3 choices. And I don't think that's necessarily, if we can get the political will to do it, I think this is something we could implement. I think it'll be a little difficult because of federal and state, and I'm not sure exactly, this is research for maybe a subsequent talk, but how the states and the federal government were able to agree on a system of voting. So maybe that's something you guys should look into if you want to change the future. But theoretically, it's possible that what you call instant runoff voting, you go and you vote for your top two or your top three choices, and then you don't have that problem because if your top choice doesn't get it, you can vote. Your vote still counts towards the ultimate president-elect. And then that way you avoid the two-party problem of you just vote against the person you dislike the most, right? Which is probably more so than any other election cycle the case in this election cycle, right? Although, I mean, on the one hand, we all say every year that this is the most important election ever, right? Is that not always the case? But I think more so than any other year that not voting for the other person is the philosophy here. So we have to agree on things. So if we're talking about are we stuck in the two-party system, there are certain things we have to agree on. Number one, the current system is broken. Why? Because, and this is another thing we didn't talk about yet, but the lack of difference between the two major parties. Our foreign policies remain the same for the last 150 years. I mean, the audience is mostly Muslim, so we kind of feel, a certain way about our involvement in the Middle East. But if you would ask somebody in the Middle East before 1920 what they thought of America, they would have said, "Oh yeah, America's great. It's an amazing place." And to be sure, a lot of people still think that way and feel that way. Of course, we all, at some level, like America, I would imagine. We love our country. And still, people immigrate from other countries, so people still conceive of America as this great country in a way. But in other ways, even people that want to immigrate here are keenly aware of our foreign policy, interventionism, and the problems therein. That being said, if you had asked somebody before 1920, I mean, they had no problem with America, right? Nobody had any problem with America because we had nothing to do with the Middle East. It was British colonialism at the time. But our foreign policy was still the same, where in South America, we had all types of colonialist enterprises over there, or imperialist corporatist interests over there. For example, I know one time reading from a history textbook, I saw that there was this Caribbean island that had some kind of plantation, and when the workers refused to work, somebody called up a battleship, a U.S. battleship, parked right off the coast, and then magically everybody went back to work. Would you look at that? But the point is that we can all agree on these types of things, right? I mean, whether you're green or you're socialist or libertarian, you can agree on these anti-corporate interests. So that's something we have to agree on, and I think that's something that, it can change, right? And I think the bottom line, really for me anyway, is that change comes about socially, not politically. I think this is probably the most important. Again, we have to agree on certain things. We have to agree on an end to, let's say, the Electoral College, an end to, the two-party system as we understand it today. But I think the most important thing, even more important than that, and I hope you do go out and advocate for those things, is that change comes about socially, not politically. You're not going to vote change into office. You're not going to vote a revolution. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but you're not going to vote a revolution into office. Sorry, not going to happen. Change is maybe 10% political, 90% social, just to put arbitrary numbers on it. And because it's problematic when you put all your hopes and dreams in one person or an office, and especially when you have like big institutional problems, it's not how it works. The only way change is going to come about is when you convince enough people, that your philosophy is right, and then those people go and run for office, and they go into the office with the intention of repealing, the drug war, for example, repealing our imperialist foreign policy. That's really the only way change comes about.